Hello class, I'm Instructor Hollon and this lecture is on free will. It covers both freedom and related issues in metaphysics and the philosophy of action. What does it mean to say that a human being possesses free will? How is freedom defined? Is there such a thing as freedom of thought, will, and action? There are two different fields of discussion in which the topic of freedom arises in philosophy: political and metaphysical. Both require the unconstrained power to act autonomously of one's own volition. That is, conceptions of freedom, freedom in both political and metaphysical philosophy do. However, one concerns our freedom in the political sphere, such as societal freedom to live how we desire, and the other concerns our freedom in nature, freedom to act independent of the causal laws of nature, for example. Since our current discussion in this lecture centers on the metaphysical discussion of freedom, only brief comments about political freedom are mentioned here. Political freedom involves two kinds of freedom, basically. One, freedom from X, or negative freedom, and two, freedom to do X, or positive freedom. The notion of political freedom then requires the ability to exemplify both positive, to exemplify either positive and or negative freedom in the context of the relationship between the individual and the state. This means that the ruling power cannot be an oppressor, force something on the people, interference, or restrict your freedoms to do things. So we'll return to the question of the good in political philosophy in another lecture. Here we'll continue with the question of free will in metaphysics. Turning to the discussion of metaphysical freedom, consider first the theory of determinism. The theory that every event in the universe, including human actions, have natural explanatory causes. For further details, see Levin 2020, page 100, and Archie and Archie 2004, pages 195 to 196. For our purposes, determinism may be defined as follows. Determinism is the conjunction of the laws of nature and the past, so the laws of nature and the past together, jointly fix and cause a unique sequence of physical events. Okay? So the laws and the past together fix one sequence of events. This is the problem. The problem is that this understanding of causal history of the world then renders the concept of freedom of choice suspect, doubtful, because our decisions and actions have already been fixed millions of years ago and have complete natural causal explanations. So it raises a threat to our conception of free will. As Levin puts it, some conceive free will to be the capacity to make choices in which the outcome has not been determined by past events. Determinism suggests that only one course of events is possible, which is inconsistent with the existence of such free will. This problem has been identified in ancient Greek philosophy and remains a major focus of philosophical debate. See Levin 2020, page 100. So with this definition in hand, definitions for freedom and for determinism, freedom generally and determinism, consider the following two syllogisms against metaphysical freedom. Okay. Premise 1: every event has a sufficient natural explanatory cause. Premise 2: every human choice or action is an event. Conclusion: therefore, every human choice or action has a sufficient natural explanatory cause. First syllogism. Now the second one: every human choice or action has a sufficient natural explanatory cause. Premise 2, I list it as 5 in the lecture, but for this second argument, premise 2, to have explanatory causes is not to be free. We'll say sufficient natural explanatory causes. Therefore, no human choice or action is free. Philosophers have developed different ways of trying to respond to this sequence of arguments. For starters, the conclusion is not obviously true, the final one, since we exercise control and power daily as we make decisions regarding which different types of drinks we'd like and whether we want to go to work, etc. So the discussion of the arguments for determinism continues. In light of the continued discussion and exchange, consider next different definitions for freedom. The first working definition of metaphysical freedom runs along the following lines. This view is called libertarian freedom. An action or decision is free if and only if 1. A person can choose more than one course of action or has alternative outcomes. They can either do an action or not, or do an alternative action or not. And 2, the second condition, a person is the origin of the action. Okay, so libertarian freedom says an action is or decision is free if you can do otherwise, and if you're the source of the action. Based on this idea of freedom, some philosophers reject determinism because they're more sure of their felt experience of freedom than the arguments for determinism at which we just looked. Well, they're actually different arguments. I'm sorry. But the arguments at which we looked raise a problem for freedom based on a definition of determinism. Okay, so these philosophers, though, are more sure that they're free than that determinism is true, and that the evidence for determinism is scant. It's not. It's more a philosophical commitment and position than a scientific one. Okay, so these philosophers are called libertarians, and they introduce a causal gap in history, a break between the conjunctive sequence of causal laws and the past and human actions, in order to make room for free action. For example, see Roderick Chisholm, Human Freedom and the Self, and this is a very famous piece that I've linked in the lecture for this week. So the idea is this: the laws and the past together fix a sequence of events causally. They cause a certain sequence of events to happen. But for the libertarian, on this conception of freedom, actions of the agents, they end up breaking the causal connection between the events. Because if your action is explicable by past events, then you're not the source of the action. And if determinism is true, there's only one sequence of events. If that's the case, then you can't choose otherwise. You don't have alternatives. So the libertarian says, well, you have alternatives and you're the source of the action. So in that case, the causal laws have to be broken between the events in order to allow the agent room to bring about some event of their own, to be the source of the event, the cause of the event itself. So they end up creating what we call causal gaps in nature. Okay, and I give a diagram in the lecture if you want to give it a look, but the explanation I've provided in this lecture should be fine. So the idea then is that the conjunction of the laws and the past cause a sequence of events from event 1, 2, and 3, but a human action breaks this causal sequence and introduces an otherwise undetermined cause of the following event, E5. So E4 is missing, right? Hence the causal gap. While this view seems to run into problems with scientific explanations of behavior, it may draw support from some of the models in contemporary quantum mechanics that feature uncaused events. So the concern there is with the scientific study of more soft science, right? But scientific study of psychology and so forth helps us identify natural explanations of behavior, so we don't need to introduce these causal gaps, right? Okay, well, the libertarian says you can't do that all the time, though. Okay. But additionally, in order to try to respond to this concern from psychology and maybe even neuroscience, other fields where we don't need causal gaps to make sense of behavior, human actions, libertarians point to quantum mechanics. in which concept the concept of uncaused events emerges, and some people believe. So, for example, some people think the universe doesn't have a cause, right? So that would be an example of a really big event with no cause. So if that can be true of the universe, why couldn't it be true of human actions too? Right? Something like that. So this brings us to the debate between determinism and indeterminism. Another way of responding to the determinist's argument is to redefine what is meant by freedom. So freedom in this case is defined in such a way as to be compatible with determinism. This position is called compatibilism or soft determinism. For more details, see Levin, 2020, pages 100 to 101, 123 to 126. Compatibilists have offered different definitions of freedom. Okay, libertarians have too, but they classify under general ideas. Same thing with compatibilists. Here's a list of different conditions compatibilists suggest for a definition of freedom. Okay, an action is compatibly free, or a decision is compatibly free if and only if it was not performed from external compulsion. Someone didn't make you do it. It was not performed out of ignorance. It was caused by reason. Say not a reflex, right? It was caused by the will, so you have control, again, something not involuntary, like when the doctor hits your knee and you have a reflexive action and kick your leg out. That wouldn't be a free action, all right? And 5, it follows from your character, okay? It's not out of character. So those are 5 conditions. Compatibilists might accept 4 of those, or do some working with that, but those are the kinds of ideas compatibilists have in mind when they think of freedom. Okay, so there are some alternative conditions that these are some alternative conditions that compatibilists have suggested in their attempt to redefine freedom in order to make it logically consistent with the truth of determinism. It is important here to notice that freedom is not conceived of as the categorical ability to do otherwise, it doesn't require alternative outcomes. So the concern is not with these alternative possibilities, but with how the action is issued in from the past and the causal laws of nature. It has to be issued in the right way, not be completely free of the laws in the past, if that makes sense. So another response to the 2 arguments in favor of determinism is to accept the truth of determinism and reject the reality of metaphysical freedom, despite appearances, because these 2 claims are thought to be logically inconsistent or incompatible with each other. See Levin, 2020, pages 120 to 122. This view is called hard determinism. The problem here is that we still have the experience of freedom, because there is an obvious difference between events, say blinks, and actions, say winks. So some things seem to happen to us in which we are passive, like a blink. We all blink involuntarily. And in some cases, though, we seem to have control over what we do, like when we give someone a wink. So if there is a difference between a blink and a wink, then there still seems to be some room to distinguish between events and actions. So what if freedom amounts to nothing more than the difference of explaining, what if freedom amounts to nothing more than explaining the difference between a wink and a blink? So long as there is a difference between being the passive recipient of an event and the active participant of an action, the notion of freedom still rises. So the hard determinist just has to ignore that distinction and say that, well, we're not free in either case, and that runs against our experience of the difference between a blink and a wink. Okay, so it asks us to disregard our own experience as misleading or illusory. Thus, the hard determinist must say the distinction is an illusion. So even though it seems that we are free, we are in fact not free. That's one other additional way of responding to the 2 arguments in favor of determinism, at which we looked in this lecture. So in addition to the material that I've assigned in the assigned readings on metaphysical freedom, whether libertarian or compatibilist conceptions of freedom, the definitions and problems of determinism, and how to interact with the problem, and looking at the various solutions and responses and such. I've included multimedia on the subject in the Engaging the Materials link in this week's module. So feel free to use that material to help process the concepts on free will and determinism and the subject of metaphysical freedom. And if you have any questions about anything in the reading or in the activities in the lecture, please feel free to send me an email or stop by Zoom office hours, or ask me a question in the discussion forums, etc. I'm happy to give further guidance and suggestions where needed. So thank you for joining me today, and I will see you guys. I'll talk with you guys soon. Bye-bye.